All right. Are we ready to go? Who are we hearing in the background there? Oh, he's all muted. All right. So we're going to take a look today at some of the stuff we did last time. We're just going to review a little bit of that again. I definitely have some time for some questions today. Hopefully the bio stuff kind of makes sense to you now. You've had lots of time to do it. And hopefully some of this stuff in terms of layout is sinking in. I have something for you to watch in one of the breaks today. It's a nice clip I've used before. A guy tries to explain the math and the golden rectangle and how it fits with design, and I think he does a really good job of it. Pardon me. So we'll take a look at some of that. Now, last time I had started into doing some layout stuff, and the biggest thing we're going to do when we talk about layout stuff is we're going to talk about Flexbox layout. And there are multiple different display styles with HTML, and they all have different kind of purposes. There is one display style that we're not going to get into. Maybe in the last class, we'll touch a little bit on it, and that's called a grid style. And the challenge with the grid style is it's fairly in depth to try and set a basic grid up to get it working, and it's predominantly used for web applications, not web pages. So we'll kind of leave that off until next term. The style we want to focus on is the Flexbox style because it is so powerful in being able to build nice creative layouts that you can manipulate the way you want. And the way we get that to happen is we start to nest things together. So we use that Flexbox layout to help us understand how we're going to synchronize some things. Up to now, we've kind of looked at block flow, which is what divs do by default. We've looked at inline flow, which is what spans do by default. There's a display type called inline block, which behaves slightly differently with Chrome and Firefox, but it tries to bridge the gap between the two of them. All of those display styles are designed for pure documents. If you're trying to recreate some document online, the idea here is that even if you want to do a multi-column layout, it's easier to do with things flowing as paragraphs in blocks. At the point that we start to build websites for people, they're collections of web pages to convey certain pieces of content, and some of it is static and some of it is dynamic. And what we mean by that is that some of the content in these web pages doesn't change ever. It's static. But some is dynamic. Some is changed every time you look at it. Now, the way that happens with our web browser is through the use of JavaScript. And while we're not going to get into that, there are ways that we can lay out our pages so that that dynamic content is contained in its own little area. And so we want to design things that can adapt to different sizes of content because they're dynamic and we don't know how big they're going to be until we actually see it. This is where Flexbox started to come into its own. We started to decide that, having a block or an inline type flow wasn't really conducive to these kind of dynamic, changing content areas. So what we started doing is coming up with ways in which we could create areas and we could control the flow of sub-items within those areas. Now, with all of the standard flow kinds of things. You would control things by adjusting the heights, the widths of various different block elements. And you would float those elements from left to right. And that would create your flow. As we start to do dynamic things, we start to abandon the idea of doing paragraphs. And instead, we're just doing divs or containers. And that floating style starts to become really cumbersome, as you noticed, in trying to get things to line up the way you want them to. Especially getting things centered both horizontally and vertically. And it's even more frustrating because programmatically it's a relatively trivial task. And when we talked about how we float these things around, we would often have to build styles that are kind of like this, where we would have a specific width and a height, and we would float them from one side to the other. And every time the browser gets something like this, it's always just trying to fill its current width. So when you specify how things fit together, they would flow from left to right, right to left, and they would fill up whatever width they could until they hit the edge of the browser. And if the next thing was capable of flowing onto the next line, it would. And if it couldn't, or if it couldn't fit on the same line, then it would just wrap down below. Again, predictability becomes a little bit hard here. And that's how inline block works, which is fine for documents. And we may even use inline block within our sites and pages these days if we have a section or a part that very much resembles a document. So in your bio pages, there's definitely areas that are done like a document. And so you might actually use some of these inline block sections inside divs, inside other areas. But when we started getting dynamic content and we started actually wanting to center things, we needed a better solution. And so with the latest iterations, we talked about the other day, that we start to use some special styles to deal with getting the way specific items are aligned, whether it's right to left or top to down. We had to figure out if there's a way we can automatically order things, and we have to identify if there's a specific way that we can resize or rescale things. And what I mean by that is when we have a container and we have 4 containers inside it, as we stretch the browser, we want to be able to have those things stretch as well. But we don't necessarily want them to stretch exactly equal with each other. There are times where we may want to have 3 items in that container, and we may want one item to be more dominant than the other, so we want it to stretch twice as fast as the others. So we want to be able to control that. And that's where these ideas, these flex containers, started to arrive. And nowadays, what most web page designers do is they assume they're going to build them in a Flexbox. And a Flexbox is the name for the container. And quite often it's called a flex container as a CSS style so that it's completely obvious. For a lot of people, we also drop the flex prefix on it. It's just a container. And inside the container, we have a bunch of items. And the part to wrap your head around is that any item can also be a container. So when we started talking the other day about building a kind of nice site that had a reasonable layout, we started looking at how exactly could we diagram that, or how could we kind of imagine that. And that's where I went to my little diagram that I did, where we kind of imagined a particular way of representing a page we wanted to do, a landing page or a promotional page. And so I started with a standard kind of sketch. Now there's a million tools to do this stuff. I prefer to do it with pen and paper or in the drawing tablet, whatever I have, they're available to me just because it's super fast. And as we start to identify the different parts of our page and our site, we then migrate over into a plan for how we're going to build things. And part of what we're doing here is we're trying to break down our problem into smaller, easier to manage problems. This is a common theme. This particular problem I broke down into a couple simpler problems. Let's see if I actually broke the layers apart nicely there. So we start with a page, and then we added the main areas to the page as we went. And I want these things to be in the red box, which is a flex box. And I want the items, the green items, to be put into that flex box as a column of things. I want them stretched full width. And I can do that with just a couple CSS styles with my Flexbox. Now, I also identified that I'm going to have this main content area. And in that main content area, I'm also going to have some stuff. And that stuff that I'm going to have there, let me just add it now, is really, that's it, something that color, is really a bunch of sub-items. But these ones I want to arrange column-wise. And I might not want them all to grow or shrink at the same rate. So what I'm building up here is a plan for how am I going to implement my site. And at the same time, I'm identifying to myself, how am I going to build this? So I'm going to build it in chunks or pieces. We're going to use the flex container and the flex items. And the flex items don't really have a lot of styles on them if we look up the details. The flex container has most of the heavy work, the heavy lifting that it does. So when we look at some of the styles that we're going to attach there, for the container part, we're going to declare that display is type flex, not block, not inline block, but the display type flex. And then we're going to add the Flexbox specific styles to tell it how to arrange all of the sub-containers inside there. Once we arrange the sub-containers, we can then take a look and drill down into any one of the sub-containers. And from those sub-containers, we can then determine whether that sub-container also needs to be a Flexbox. Going back to look at our diagram, we can see that one of these items, and I'm going to try and overscribe this a bit. Back to my bright white, make it fat. Too fat. There we go. So I have a box, and that main box is my main page. And inside there, I have 3 items arranged as a column. I'm going to turn some things off because the lines get a bit confusing in there. So if I just think of my entire page as a box, and that I have 3 items inside that box, and that box is a flex box, I can tell those 3 items to arrange themselves in a column. I can tell them to justify themselves how I want, whether I want them centered or left, right, or I want the space to be even between them. And I can identify for each item, what am I going to do to try and create something within each item. Now, I can go to the next step and decide that one of these items is now its own self-contained little flex box. So I'm going to make it a flex display as well. And inside there, I decide I'm going to do my header and my navigation. So that's that problem solved. Go back to my overview, and now I deal with the middle box here. And with the middle box, I have another flex container. But this one is going to have the bulk of my content. And I'm going to have my inner items in there. So in every stage, what we're really doing is we're looking at our big picture design on the left here, and we're trying to figure out, how do I best break this problem down into smaller problems? And every time we break it down into smaller problems, we're going to give ourselves a much greater chance of success of building our entire application. We just need to know a couple other things, and that is, what can we do with these flex boxes? Right? So we trigger it by making a container the display flex. We use the justify content on the container to define the horizontal or the left to right orientation of things. We use align items on the container to identify the top to bottom orientation of the things. We use the flex direction to switch up whether things go left to right in columns or top to bottom in rows. And we can use a couple other different flex styles, row reverse or column reverse, to flip the item's order. If we want to itemize things from right to left, then we can change the order of those. And then we can identify within each item if it has a specific order in its parent container. And those specific items can be rearranged, so when we align them left to right, they show up in the right sequence. The other thing we can put on an individual item is the flex value. And this is just a number, but it's a ratio. So if we look back at our diagram here, and I set up these guys, the default is 1. But if I set this one to 2, that means as I stretch the browser this way, the outer container is going to grow with the browser. The inner items are also going to grow with the browser. They're going to get wider. But how are they going to get wider? And what these flex styles do on an individual item is say that this box grows twice as fast as this box or this box. So if I make the first box and the second box twice as wide, I make the third box 4 times as wide, twice as fast. So it's a ratio of how they grow. And that starts us down the path of getting towards some more sophisticated and advanced layouts. And those layouts are the focus of the next thing I want you to start working on, which is I want you to build a basic template for a multi-panel layout. I want you to use the Flexbox to do this. And we're going to take a little bit of time today to do some of those components with you. The trick with those things is we're going to make them what we call reactive. And I'm sure you've heard of responsive design before. And responsive design involves using a bunch of CSS special capabilities to detect what the current state of the browser is in terms of its size, its width, which particular machine it's running on, what kind of platform it's running on. We're not going to go quite that far, but what we do want to do is we do want to have our browser sizing affect the way our layout looks. We want it to move and flow nicely as we make the browser smaller. Because when we make the browser smaller, we're also simulating what happens on a mobile device. And one of the things we'll learn very quickly is that designing things to work on a standard PC or a standard Mac, a normal type computer screen, is a very easy task compared to making something work and look right on a mobile device. And these days, we kind of expect that every web page or every website we build works equally well on a mobile device as it does on our on our page. So this first step is making reactive layouts. So we're going to take a little bit of time right now. I'm going to flip over to the editor, and we're going to take a look at the basic layout for our Flex landing page we did last time. Pardon me a sec. Let's see if we get this guy. And then, so this is our landing page from last time. If I take a look down here, I'm going to start my live share again. So you can follow along and actually read what's going on. Right. There you go. All right. So as you have a quick look at what I've got here, I'm going to collapse up some stuff in the editor so we can see it. As we do more complex pages, you're going to start to find the HTML pages start to grow. And this is one of the biggest challenges we have. We have no way to separate this out into separate individual pages without creating anchors and links to them. So for the most part, we're going to build it as one page, and that means we need to keep it organized so that we know what part we're working with. I'm going to use the editor's capabilities to collapse up some stuff, and that's these little arrows on the side. And these little arrows on the side let me collapse different regions. And I do that specifically so I can fit things in a page and I can see visually what's going to happen in my page. Now, I've got a head section and a body section. And in my head section, all I have is the title in the title bar. And then I have my two style sheets. I have my base styles, all the kind of resets that I typically do. And then I have my styles for this page. Then in my body section, I'm using it as a flex container, just like I did in the diagram. And I have three main areas, a header, a main, and a footer. And I'm making those flex containers as well. I want the main area and the header area to work column-wise. This guy, I'm going to make rows. Right? And I'm going to do that so that my content can kind of line up nicely in those different regions. And then I'm going to attach some stuff. I'm going to kind of hook things into my styles to make them fit the way I want. Now, a couple of things I'm going to do, if you look at the actual output here, is the first thing I did is I glued a footer to the bottom of the page. the way we glue the footer to the bottom of the page is we change the position to be fixed. And we tell it that it's 0 units of any kind from the bottom of the page. We can do things like that with the header as well. And now I can glue things to the top and the bottom. When you do this, you're kind of mixing these display, position, flow, layout things. And one of the things you'll notice in my layout is my main section, when I fixed the header to the top, my main section went right to the top. It now goes underneath. So I either need to put some sort of padding in there, or I need to somehow create that spacing. Right? So I want that position fixed at the top, but I also need something to push it down a little bit. Now we can do this with a margin. The problem with the margin is it's going to change as we make that header bigger or smaller. We can do it with a container, and just putting another container above in my main section will kind of do it for me. The problem is I have the same problem with the container. I now have to make the container exactly the same size as my header. So I've got this kind of weird, how am I going to make this happen? And you know what? There is no real simple, easy way to do this. So for now, let's just drop our header down, our main content down with a margin. Long term, what we typically do is we typically build containers inside containers to help manage this. And let's just take a guess of 10 characters. Oh, that's too much. That's cool enough. So just a guess there, right? Now we can focus on the stuff that's in each of those areas. And kind of the stuff we want to look at has to do with what kind of things do we need in our page. So again, we're going to break the problem down. First problem, in our header, we've got these sections which show us our titles and making sure that our title and banner stuff get set up the right way. The other thing I'm going to do, this flex container, I think what I want to do is center things. And so with my flex container, I'm going to have to add some styles to make this centered. And it's going on the container part. So I'm going to have to look at what do I have in my styles that I can use to center it. Now my flex container tries to align items top to bottom the center, but justify content doesn't do it. So I've got columns going on there which says flex start. So let's change that to space around. All right. Now I've got lots of different divs using the same style. So that's going to affect a whole bunch of different things if I start messing with this too much. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a new class just for my header content. And we're going to justify content. And now we're going to take that header column, so we're going to go use it. instead of flex columns, header columns. And we'll see we can't get our text to align there. What are we missing? Well, it's this thing that needs to be. All right. So those things are centered. I can see those. Now I've got these two things. And what I want to do is center this guy. So now we see some really weird behavior happening here. What's really going on is that it's oversized. We're going to bring up our inspector where we can take a look. And it's set to display block, which is probably what's making my stuff interesting. And what is it? Got there. I'm just testing this out. And it's probably not happy with the fact that the width is not. Yeah. So you're going to run into these kinds of errors. You see what I'm looking at here? Let me just do this. What I'm looking at here. So I'm just highlighting the item in the inspector. So I'm like, hey, I've set all the flex things right. How come it's not working? I've set display to be flex. I've justified the content to be center, which it's kind of trying to do. But what I haven't done is told it how wide a container it has. And so what it's done is it takes a look at the content and says, well, I'll just make it kind of a default width that fits the content. Until I tell it specifically that it needs to be a certain size or certain width, then it's going to just try and take a normal kind of approach to fitting generic content in. And I'm doing this all in the inspector here. Let's try that. So as I look at this,